Welcome to this panel. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm the director of the Center Asia Program at George Washington University. I'd like to start this panel first by thanking Leila Seidbeck and Freedom for Eurasia and Kate Waters and Crude Accountability for convening these very important discussions on Central Asia, kleptocracies as systemic human rights abusers and a cause of global instability. And I would say especially in these very turbulent times. For more than 3 decades, the states of Central Asia have lived under a deeply entrenched system of authoritarianism and neo-patrimonial governance. And despite the formal trappings of elections and constitutions, power in the region has remained concentrated in narrow ruling circles where the boundaries between public office and private wealth are often very thin. And in such systems, corruption is not simply tolerated, it is institutionalized. It's a mode of rule through which elites manage authority, through which elites distribute privilege, and through which elites neutralize opposition. And this political economy of control has had serious consequences on human rights. Independent media and civil society are viewed much more as threats to the regime's survival than as partners in governance. The imprisonment of journalists, the silencing of activists, the harassment of lawyers, and the shrinking of civil space are not collateral abuses. They are intrinsic to this logic of kleptocracy. Central Asian regimes repress dissent not only to protect their image, but to safeguard the flow of rents and illicit capital that sustain their rule. One point I would like to mention is that, however, Central Asia's authoritarian resilience cannot be understood in isolation. The region is also embedded in a wide ecosystem of autocratic cooperation that extends from Moscow to Beijing. Russian political culture has long normalized the fusion of state and wealth, and China's model of economic growth without political liberalization offers, I would say, an attractive blueprint for Central Asian rulers. Through investment, through security cooperation, digital surveillance technology, Beijing and Moscow have enabled local regimes to modernize repression, to shield their assets, and to suppress transnational activism. And this authoritarian entanglement has global implications. Central Asian authoritarian regimes do not merely violate human rights at home. They export their influence abroad, laundering money through Western financial systems, undermining sanctions, and extending their coercive reach through digital monitoring and through diaspora intimidation, as we very unfortunately see here, for example, with the proliferation of gongos during this meeting. The result is a feedback loop between domestic repression and international complicity. Ill-gotten wealth seeks refuge in democratic jurisdictions, while it returns finances for further violations. So I guess the goal of this panel today is to move beyond the notion of corruption as a moral failing and instead examine it as governing technology, one that links authoritarianism, economic capture, and human rights abuses into a single self-reinforcing system. And only by recognizing these connections can we begin to imagine effective strategies for accountability, transparency, and genuine partnership with the citizens of Central Asia who continue to resist this structure with great courage and determination. So we have 4 panelists, all specialists of these issues today. And we're going to start with Oliver Bello, who is going to present online. Oliver Bello is an award-winning journalist. He's the author of Bad Luck to the World, How Britain Became the Servant of Tycoons, Tax Dodgers, Kleptocratic Criminals, and of another book, Moneyland, White Thieves and Crooks, Now Rule the World and How to Take It Back. His articles on issues of financial transparency and corruption appear in The Guardian, Sunday Times, JQ Magazine. He also writes a weekly oligarchy newsletter for Coda Story. So, Oliver, the floor is yours. Oliver, can you hear us?
I think he's muted. What?
Should I move to top? Ah. No.
I think go if we need to.
Okay.
Does he say anything? Is the technician here to see if... Does he hear it? Because he seems to be muted.
Yeah, we could.
That's somebody else's screen, isn't it?
He was on the screen just a few minutes ago.
This is unmuted. We've got him.
Okay, so maybe we move to top.
Yeah, we can probably move to Tom. Can you?
Okay, yeah, maybe, yeah. Tom maybe can take the floor and then we'll move back to Oliver. So just I'm going to introduce you very briefly. Oh, he's here?
I can see him on my screen. Can you close this window?
I'm here. Hello.
Ah, okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay, we hear you.
Good. Hello. Sorry, I'm late.
Yeah, you can start. I already introduced you.
Okay, well, I didn't hear the introduction. Apologies. Could you repeat that?
Oh. Yeah, so no, I actually read your biography, saying that you're an award-winning journalist, author of books and articles on issues of financial transparency and corruption, which appear in The Guardian, Sunday Times, JQ Magazine, and that you also write a weekly oligarchy newsletter for Coda Story. So I explained all of that. So the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'm going to start in a very general way before we get into the specifics of what we're talking about, which is just about the substance of what I tend to write about, which is why it is that the dream of bringing democracy to the former Soviet Union in general, and of course Central Asia in particular, turned sour. And there are obviously many small reasons for this, and many of those are specific, of course, to the individual countries of the region. But I think it's really important to recognize the overarching role that corruption and kleptocracy plays in that problem, which is that after 1991, the newly independent countries were born into a world where it was incredibly easy, unprecedentedly easy, for the elites of those countries to steal and from the countries they were supposedly ruling, and to hide that money elsewhere in a way that had never been the case for newly independent countries in Europe or Eurasia before, and far more, there was a far closer parallel to the independence of the ex-colonies of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1960s. And if the elites are able to steal money, hide it offshore, and continue to enjoy the use of it in a way that simply wasn't possible in the past, thanks to the mechanisms of offshore finance and increasingly globalized banking system of the time, then essentially their interests are just not the same as the interests of the people that they're ruling, because the people that they're ruling might want, you know, good streets or good schools, good hospitals, whereas the people ruling the countries just want to steal as much money as possible for them. And the difficulty which this causes in the long term is that the possession of wealth in almost any country, particularly in a country with developing institutions rather than well-established institutions, the possession of wealth simply is the same thing as power. So once you have managed to accumulate wealth, and even if that wealth is not being kept in the country where you live, instead it's being invested in the form of property in London or financial assets in Switzerland or the United States or wherever, then you can continue to dominate the country, even as has been the case repeatedly in Kyrgyzstan in particular, even if there have been revolutions to try and get rid of you, because even though they may get rid of you physically as a person, they don't get rid of your influence in the long term because of the wealth that you possess. And it's a real challenge that we as a civilization face of what to do about this situation and this system that we have created. Obviously, thanks to the war in Ukraine and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, there has been a greater realization of the pernicious influence that the Russian elites are able to project thanks to their mastery of the offshore financial world. But that same recognition has not been extended to the other countries of the former Soviet Union, or indeed other countries elsewhere in the world. And it is a particular concern of mine to see how the Russian sanctions evasion machine is now particularly making use of structures in Bishkek in the crypto space, thanks to Kyrgyzstan's pivot towards crypto, that we have seen the development of A7, A5 and other similar structures to help Russians use Central Asia to evade sanctions imposed upon them by the West. And that does, suggest not just that there is no particular appetite to fighting back against the dangers posed by the offshore klepto enabling machine that we've seen impoverish these countries, but they're actually leaning in and becoming part of it themselves. So that's essentially what I wanted to say in introduction. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So our next second speaker will be Thomas Main, who is a director at Freedom for Eurasia. His research focuses on anti-money laundering legislation, grant corruption, and kleptocracy. He's a research fellow at the University of Exeter. He researches linkages between Russia's foreign policy and illicit financial flows. He's a former visiting fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and for 12 years he was a senior campaigner for anti-corruption NGO Global Witness. And Tom calls indulging kleptocracy, post-communist elites, and corruption in 2024. Tom, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, many thanks for being here, great to see you. Great to see Elvis being to us from the UK. Always knew he was very interested in kleptocracy. So I think Oliver's set the scene very well. I'm going to give you just a crash course in kleptocracy, the top 6 things that you need to know. I think as Oliver says, the first point is that it's not just about personal enrichment. If you control the assets, if you keep the assets within your clan, your tribe, your family, your political party, you manage to maintain power. Therefore, the first point I want to say is it is systematic. Kleptocracy is systematic. It's not just a bad politician here or there, which if you would get rid of, you would solve the system. And that's why I think the comparison often made to organized crime structures, where you have almost a pyramid structure with money being funneled up towards the top. In an organized crime structure, you have the underlings, the capos and the consiglieres sending money up the chain to the don. Very similar to what we see in kleptocracies with the junior ministers generating money, sending money up the chain to the ministers, to the Prime Minister and to the President. And that leads me to my second point, that the dividing line between public and private is completely obliterated in a kleptocracy. Many examples of that. We could mention the Turkmen president with personal control over the foreign currency reserves of Turkmenistan, or a recent report that Freedom for Eurasia published about Kazakhstan called the Napoleon Complex, where we showed that at the time he was Deputy Prime Minister, Karim Masimov, one of the most senior figures in Kazakhstan, owned a private share of the state telecoms provider Kazakh Telecom. So as he was responsible for making decisions that would benefit this telecoms company, he was also profiting from it personally. So there was no difference really between the state and private business. The third thing I want you to remember is that this has been facilitated by the United Kingdom, the EU, and us in the West. Yes, we all know about offshore and dodgy dealings. What is, I think, quite surprising, or maybe not, if you know kleptocracy, is how mainstream some of these deals are. If you look at the UK, Kazakhmys PLC, copper company listed on the London Stock Exchange. Not only that, it was for a time part of the FTSE 100. So a lot of us in the UK were relying on Kazakhmys and other companies in the FTSE 100 for our pensions and our investments. And yet, what did we find when we looked at Kazakhmys PLC? I wrote a report on this particular company many years ago. Well, we found that the president of Kazakhstan's best friend, his former chief of staff, Vladimir Ni, was on the board of Kazakhmys. And in 2006, he was given by the largest shareholder in the company 2.5% of the company for free. Now that share was worth about 135 million pounds. Again, no dividing line between public and private. And this was not some small company, this was a London listed company. And that's before we even go into looking at the hundreds of lawyers, estate agents, bankers who exist in London and Geneva and elsewhere who facilitate these deals by turning a blind eye and not asking the right questions. So that leads me to the fourth point, that of the negative effect that this has on the UK and EU. You might think, oh well, Kazakh companies listing in London, that sounds good. We all make money, right? Well, Kazakhmys delisted, as did another company, ENRC. The share price having dropped by about 30%. It's also embroiled in a bribery scandal investigated by the Serious Fraud Office. That case unfortunately collapsed, and now ENRC is trying to sue the UK government for $290 million worth of damages. Think of the countless millions that the UK government has already spent investigating this case. The net benefit to the UK economy surely has to be a negative. We could talk about the Azerbaijani regime, the caviar diplomacy scandal, where it was proven, this is not just an allegation, an Italian politician went to jail, was found guilty of accepting a bribe from the Azerbaijani regime in order to receive money in order to vote down a report criticising Azerbaijan's human rights abuses. So these are real things that have had an impact on our democracy and our rule of law. We could talk about slaps, legal cases, libel cases brought often in London against journalists such as Oliver or Tom Burgess or Catherine Belton or whoever it may be, who dare to write about these deals. And that leads me to my fifth point, that the money laundering regulations to deal with kleptocracy are useless. If you just want one example, the Financial Action Task Force blacklisted Russia around about 2000. Russia did a few things, supposedly tidying up their money laundering controls, and since 2000 until Russia was suspended, by the FATF after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia was not grey listed for a single week by the Financial Action Task Force from 2000 to 2022. Meanwhile, who was grey listed? Jamaica, South Africa, Croatia. And who do you think poses a greater risk to the global financial system? Is it Jamaica or is it Russia? If you want to throw another country in there, how about the UK? The UK always gets a glowing report from their Financial Action Task Force. Do we really believe that more dirty money is flowing through Jamaican banks than from banks in London? I think not. And even if we could, perhaps, I mean, the FATF doesn't really look at kleptocracy. That's not what it is tasked with. But even if it were, and we somehow had a perfect list of kleptocracies that financial professionals were to take note of, would it make a difference? Part of the problem of kleptocracy is the fact that the money has been, in quotes, legalized in the country in question, in the kleptocracy, by a corrupt official or a corrupt law court, which has ruled that particular deal is legal. Or perhaps the money just simply is legal. We think about Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. He was not a drug dealer. He made his money completely legitimately, supplying food to the military and schools in Russia. So if that money was to end up in the UK, prior to obviously him being sanctioned, what incentive does a lawyer have for refusing that money? So that leads me to my final point, which is the sixth and final point, that we need new laws in order to properly tackle kleptocracy. We need to move from freeze to seize. Sanctions are useful. They freeze the money, but they do not seize it, and they are reactive to a particular situation. They don't prevent the money from coming here in the first place, and nor does it lead to asset recovery, or at least easy asset recovery. The problem is with asset recovery is you have to show that the money is linked to a crime, and when the evidence is in Russia or Kazakhstan, it's going to be virtually impossible to prove to a court that that money is the proceeds of crime. So what me and my colleagues, John Heathershaw, Miriam Nitsera and Tena Prelitz, have proposed is coming up with a new law that would allow assets that have been produced by a kleptocratic enterprise to be frozen and then seized. We have a paper we're working on at the moment, and this would work similar to how we can designate something as a terrorist asset. We can make it more easy for that asset to be seized. In closing, I would say that corruption leaders stealing from their people is not new. It's been going on thousands of years. What is new is this transnational aspect of it, the fact that these kleptocratic networks steal from their own countries and bring it into the safe havens of the UK in the EU. And as a result of the newness of these schemes, we need new laws in order to tackle them. If not, we're going to have this same laundromat of money with billions of dollars passing through London and the EU with nothing being able to be done about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So let's move now to our third speaker, Leila Seidbek, who is an exact lawyer, anti-corruption and human rights advocate from the Kyrgyz Republic. Leila was granted asylum in Austria in 2021, and she's a chairwoman of Freedom for Eurasia, which documents and reports on human rights abuses and corruption in Eurasia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sebastian, for your introduction. So what I want to contribute to what Oliver and Tom have said about kleptocracy is that it was or has been disturbing to me throughout my work on kleptocracies in Central Asia is how much the Central Asian kleptocracies are being normalized in the Western democratic countries. People think, even the people that we speak with that represent various decision-making government structures and so on. They think, yes, these countries are corrupt, but we still can do business with them. And maybe, through doing business with them, we can probably sway them, into democratic direction. The problem is, with that line of thought, is that corruption and kleptocracy and democracy and human rights do not survive together. They cannot exist together, and they do not exist together. It is well known that all countries in Central Asia are autocracies and also kleptocracies. And as Tom has mentioned, the uniqueness of that situation is its transnationality or transnational character of the way that they function, which obviously we did not have when these countries were a part of Soviet Union, which means they somehow drew into their action field the countries that did not directly participate in their kleptocratic abuse, but are still somehow complicit because they provide them with mechanisms and places to store their stolen wealth. What is also, I think, largely missing from the international narrative is that is how the democratic countries see the people that are leading these countries, and they see them as normal politicians and statesmen, and they are not that at all. They are mafia, an organized criminal group that hold state power and use the state in order to enrich themselves. There are numerous reports, also from us, also from colleagues at OCCRP, colleagues from Transparency International and others, about the grand corruption in these countries. And these reports do not talk about some mere bribery situations. These are hundreds of millions of dollars that are being siphoned into democratic countries to be stored, enjoyed by the kleptocrats and their families and their girlfriends and their children. And in order to protect themselves, this organized group of people, organized crime group, in power seeks to shut down any threat to its existence. And what is the threat? The threat is the human rights defenders, journalists, critics, activists, and political opposition, obviously. And I'll give you just a really recent example from yesterday in how they intimidate, and how they launch criminal cases, and how they use slander and smear campaigns against anyone who dares to speak about this. Just yesterday, the Uzbek delegation attacked me in the plenary session, and they have said that I'm a criminal, that I am wanted, and that I am facing criminal charges, which is not news, at least not to me, for many years now. And unfortunately, I am wanted by most of the countries of former Soviet Union on the Eurasian continent, aside from the Baltics. The problem is, I'm not alone. The problem is that half of the participants in this conference have either been to jail or are facing the threat of going to jail, or are in exile because they fled their own countries to avoid being jailed unlawfully and spend a lifetime in prison for crimes they did not commit on charges that have been fabricated. The other half of the participants who did not manage to come are probably unable to come because they are either in jail right now or are under house arrest. So these are the methods that are used by these countries. Their understanding of criminality is totally different from what the democratic countries have. For them, we are the criminals. The people who speak the language of democracy, the language of human rights, to them are a threat and are enemies and criminals. So where did that lead us to? We now have a complete and total destruction of civil society in Kyrgyzstan that is happening right before our eyes. We have a completely destroyed civil society in Tajikistan. It's a scorched earth situation. We have a situation that is very similar to North Korea and Turkmenistan, where it's just so close, it's incredible. And people still think in the West, the decision makers still think in the West that the investment of even more money, that they can pledge that money and somehow change the situation. And what I want to say is, you really don't throw money at a thief and hope that it's gonna improve him somehow. It's not gonna work. And so when I heard the news that the European Union is pledging even more money in investment to the region with literally no human rights conditions at all, that was a very scary thought for me to have. And so all of these issues of persecution that we are also hearing here at this conference, they are all symptoms of kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is trying to defend themselves. The question is only, what are the democratic countries going to do about this? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leila. So our fourth and last speaker will be Kate Waters, who is a co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, which is an environmental and human rights non-profit founded in 2003. Since the early 1990s, Kate reports on environment, oil and gas, and human rights in Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Caspian and Black Sea regions, and Russia. And Kate holds an MA in Russian Area Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in Russian Literature for UMass Amherst. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you all for being here early in the morning, and thank you to my co-panelists and to Leila particularly for organizing this event. Very important. I want to build on what the previous speakers have talked about, but really particularly with a focus on what does kleptocracy and corruption, perhaps even more with a focus on corruption in the context of kleptocracy, what does that mean for civil society? And what are the dangers and the limitations that are specific to civil society activists and that hinder civil society activists in Central Asia, and particularly looking at the impacts in the fossil fuel sector, which is where I've worked for many, many years in my organization as well. We've looked at the intersection of environmental and human rights for a long time. It's always been difficult work. It's always been rife with corruption. It's always been rife with really sort of difficult decision-making, but it has never been more dangerous than it is now. And not only in Central Asia, although especially there, but throughout the world. And I think the recent reporting from Michelle Forst, who's the Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders for the UN, which really highlights the risks to environmental defenders, not only in Eurasia, but also in Europe. It helps to underscore sort of what the ripple effects, if you will, or the widening effects of threats to environmental defenders, particularly those who work in fossil fuels and extractives, are facing. As Leila stated very clearly, and as both other speakers also talked about, we face violence on regular basis, imprisonment, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, false lawsuits, slap suits. A very favorite of the oil companies is to use slap suits against environmental activists, and death and violence. Being an environmental defender is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world these days, including in our region and throughout the OSCE. And I think when we talk about the transnational nature of this, there are two aspects that I want to sort of focus on in my remarks today. And one is that, you know, especially now in the context of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we talk about Russian oil, we talk about Kazakhstani oil, we talk about Azerbaijani oil and natural gas. But when we look at who is actually extracting fossil fuels in Central Asia, we have the Chinese, we have the Americans, we have Western European companies. You look at Tengiz, for example, which is the largest oil field in Kazakhstan with a majority share held by whom? Tengiz Chevroil, which is Chevron. So are we really talking about Kazakhstani oil when we talk about benefits to populations, when we talk about benefits to people? I know we're talking about Central Asia here today, but we can make the same sort of discussion if we look at Azerbaijan and the outsized role of companies like BP in Shah Deniz, Azeri Chirag Gunishli, Sangachal. And why am I talking about this? Because the oil that comes out of Central Asia goes largely, or that comes out of Kazakhstan in particular, comes out largely through the CBC pipeline, which has been exempted from sanctions. So this means that American companies, Western European companies, Kazakhstani companies are all working together with Russian companies to get oil to the Black Sea, to Novorossiysk, where it is then going out through an active war zone to the world. And when environmental defenders and human rights defenders try to talk about this, slap suits start happening, accusations start happening, false charges appear, people are imprisoned, people are beaten up, people are detained. So this transnational nature of kleptocracy itself is an even more insidious web, I would argue, where the members of these kleptocratic structures are engaged in, as Tom mentioned, fully legal activities with corporations in the West. Then we talk about the role of international financial institutions who are financing not only through like the World Bank financing Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan or Tajikistan, but also through the private investment arm of these international financial institutions financing corporations that are engaged in this kind of activity, whether it's in fossil fuels or not, engaged with kleptocratic regimes using public money through international financial institutions to support projects. It's a web, it's an ugly, nasty web. And who pays the price at the end of the day are civil society activists, human rights defenders, environmental defenders, climate defenders. So until we start to recognize the complexity of this structure, the legality of this structure, and who's actually benefit. Sure, Berdi Mukhomedov is absolutely benefiting. The kleptocrats are absolutely benefiting. I would argue so is the CEO of Chevron. So is the head of the World Bank. So is the head of the EBRD. Not claiming they're doing anything illegal, that's part of the problem. So we have a big, big mess to untangle here, and until we acknowledge, I think, the complexity of all of it and the power that institutions like the OSCE, participating states, for example, have because their membership in all of these other institutions, we're not going to get very far, but we have the tools and mechanisms to do what we need, the political will, and we need it right away. Civil society is dying in front of our eyes. People are dying in front of our eyes. This is not a hypothetical conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Kate. So we have now a little bit more than 15 minutes for discussion, so I'm going to open the floor. Please raise your hand and introduce yourself when you ask a question. Questions, please? Really? Don't be shy. Okay, yeah, sir.
It's very interesting.
We need mic, sir.
I'm trying to be content maker. So I think it would be better if you can you do that? Anything can you do like that? Next time.
Hello? Where's the switch on here? On the bottom?
On the side.
Now?
Or you could just use this one for this one.
It's working? Hello? No? Okay, I'll speak very loud. I am with the project coordinator office.
We need
Hello?
It is.
Hello, I'm with the project coordinator office of the OSCE in Uzbekistan, and I found this presentation to be extremely interesting and thought-provoking, not just with respect to what's going on in Central Asia, but in a global sense. also a global sense in terms of the effect on civil society and, let's say, the media, which are charged with publicizing these particular issues. I'm curious to hear, since you speak about the way that kleptocracy is embedded within the economic system and within politics throughout the world, to what extent does the idea of cooperation within the OSCE perhaps legitimize certain structures that are continuing to grow and develop and that are actually working against civil society?
No, Oliver, do you want to take that question?
Hello. I mean, that's a huge question, and obviously quite a lot of what has already been kind of touches on that to a certain extent. I think one of the big problems that particularly Central Asia has faced is the fact that since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the attempts to exclude Russian firms in particular from the international oil market, or certainly to exclude them from trading at full price in the international oil market, Western countries have been scrabbling around for any oil they can get. So anyone who has oil has been essentially receiving a free pass to provide oil, and that means that they can get away with almost anything they like, whether that's obviously Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or places more further afield. It is also difficult looking at the clear solutions or the ideas that we have to try and restrict or limit kleptocracy involving corporate transparency, further enforcement of laws against financial crime and bribery and so on, that sadly not all members of the OSCE are, shall we say, equally committed to those principles. Particularly in the United States in the last year or 9 months, we've seen really attempts to catch up with corporate transparency over there have been cancelled or put on hold, and enforcement of real cornerstone laws such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act have also been restricted, paused or limited. And that does make it a little bit difficult to see that there's any value in a way of Western countries lecturing Central Asian countries about what they should be doing, when there really does seem to be a fall in the commitment of Western countries to doing the right thing. But then I think the idea that we can just conquer kleptocracy by just a few tweaks or a little bit of extra enforcement is always a little bit fanciful. This is incredibly, as you say, an incredibly deeply embedded system, which is as much part of the globalized financial model as anything else, really, and it has grown up alongside it. So, conquering kleptocracy is going to be very much a long-term project, if it is indeed possible at all. But I think there is still value in members of the OSCE, particularly getting together in a sort of coalition of the willing model to try and do more. There has been, I think, particularly unwelcome trend in the European Union to put the push towards corporate transparency in order to fight corruption and financial crime in opposition to the right to individual privacy, particularly around company ownership, which, I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's quite obvious that fighting financial crime and respecting people's privacy in the battle against the tech giants and so on are essentially two aspects of empowering citizens, and putting them in opposition to each other has been absurd but an effective tool used by campaigners for the rights of very wealthy people to do whatever they like. And so it does require quite a lot of clear thinking, which is easily muddied by imaginative lawyers, and it's difficult to keep going. But I have been heartened very much by hearing what everyone else has been saying, that there remain obviously people and groups who are pushing back against this at frankly what seems like at times a rather difficult and pessimistic period in human history, when so much of the progress we were making appears to have been put into reverse.
Thank you. Leila?
I also would like to add that the countries that we are talking about have been included into the OSCE family in order to sort of like lift them up and make them live up to the commitments that OSCE represents. Instead, what we are seeing right now is that these countries are dragging everybody down to their own level, and everybody seems to be so confused. In the last years, at least, we've been attending this conference. There is confusion as to how to react to their shameless efforts to drag everybody else down with them and bring everybody to the level of understanding of things and accepting things where they actually all reside, and make them share in these values, and convince everybody that doing anything against them is completely impossible. What also I think would be important, and actually in my opinion doable, is to bring the issue of kleptocracy as a security threat into a discussion among the OSCE states, and just start talking about it, start talking about the threats that these regimes and these actions pose to the democratic countries and democratic institutions, which they are aiming to erode also in the West. Why kleptocracy? I mean, one of the other angle of a kleptocracy that must be discussed within the OSCE, since it's a security organization, is the abuse of security issues, actually, and also terrorism and extremism issues in order to defend these kleptocracies, because this is exactly what we've been seeing happening in the last at least 2 decades in Central Asia, where they say that people are terrorists, and these people aren't terrorists at all. They're critics, they are journalists, they are human rights defenders, and yet still they face terrorism charges. And even if they're in exile in the European Union, that causes a great deal of difficulties to them as well, because they are being denied banking services, they are being hounded by Interpol. And so these issues I think it is very important that these issues are discussed, also because that confuses the information for the intelligence community. They no longer know who of these people are actually genuine terrorists and who of these people are journalists. It's really difficult to sort through 4,500 names on the website of National Bank of Tajikistan and understand who all these people are. And it's thousands of people from Uzbekistan, thousands of people from Kyrgyzstan, from Kazakhstan, from Turkmenistan, who are also on all of those online, sometimes publicly available databases, and obviously in the intelligence databases across Europe. Thank you.
Anatoly, yeah.
Я хочу здесь добавить, здесь есть два ключевых слова ОБСЕ: безопасность и сотрудничество. Когда нет прозрачности, всегда есть элемент подозрительности и элемент тому, что эта подозрительность приведет к коррупции. Почему слово «безопасность»? Мы знаем, что есть нормативные документы Европейского Союза, которые запрещают поставлять оружие диктаторам. Однако, что происходит? Итальянцы поставляют стрелковое оружие в Туркменистан. Для чего? Где и кто даст гарантию, что это оружие стрелковое будет не диктаторами, не будет применено к населению, гражданскому населению? Здесь нет гарантии. Где прозрачность контрактов, которые заключает Буик, французский? Где прозрачность, когда Deutsche Bank осуществляет огромные трансферы любым европейским компаниям, которые участвуют в разработке полезных ископаемых или заключают любой другой контракт? Где прозрачность? Если этой прозрачности нету, значит есть как элемент клептократии. Понимаете? Мало того, обо всем этом Европейский Союз и государства Европейского Союза, кто является членами ОБСЕ, они прекрасно об этом знают. Неоднократно мы, вот Кейп, в частности, обращались к немецкой делегации. И неоднократно этот вопрос поднимался здесь. Их здесь нету. Пусть они сюда придут и послушают. Где сотрудничество? Мы не видим этого ключевого слова «сотрудничество». А поэтому, когда я позавчера говорю, что ОБСЕ пособничает для того, чтобы демократию на евроазиатском пространстве уничтожали, вот вам ответ. Вот вам ответ. Понимаете? Мы очень много говорим о Гонго. Вы представляете, что лет 15-20 тому назад здесь сколько было правозащитников от Узбекистана, Киргизстана, Таджикистана. Я за 20 лет смотрю, что уменьшается, а увеличивается доля Гонго. Мало того, азербайджанские Гонго, когда им задают вопрос, вы что делаете здесь? Мы делаем для того, чтобы вас уничтожить. Открыто говорит, вас надо убить. Вот вам где сотрудничество. Если ОБСЕ хочет проводить какое-то совещание для Гонго, пожалуйста, соберите их, слушайте их сказки и так далее. Если вы хотите истинную демократию, тогда собирайте неправительственные организации или неправительственные организации, которые не подотчетны государству. Спасибо.
Yes.
My name is Adil Turukulov. I come from Kyrgyz Republic. My English proficiency is limited, but I try to explain. In my point of view, in transit countries like in Kyrgyzstan, media play much more important role than legal democratic institutions. Because in Western countries, in Europe, for example, you have legal branches like independent prosecutor, independent political opposition in parliament, trade unions. In my country, in Kyrgyzstan, media takes this role, and therefore they become main target for repression. And many of them forced to leave and now live in Poland, for example. Yeah? And we debate in our country how could they be effective in my country. Doing investigative reports and doing like seminars, could they be effective? And could you show us some example, how can they be effective? Thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, if I may expand this question, because indeed we talked a lot about foreign stakeholders. Leila, you mentioned the role of the EU, of human rights defenders abroad. One question indeed, which is not only related to Kyrgyzstan, but to also Central Asian countries, is what remains, for independent civil society actors now based in Central Asia. What can they do to still to document abuses, to operate? What can they do at this point, taking into account the shrinking of civil society, or as you mentioned, Leila, for example, in a country like Turkmenistan, civil society, free civil society simply does not exist.
So what can be done in countries like Turkmenistan or Tajikistan or other countries in Central Asia right now is, of course, the support to civil society is very important. And when we now hear that, for example, European Union is pledging new packages of investments and is not even including in their agenda, there are no packages or projects on the rule of law or human rights. That is a very negative and a wrong direction. So I believe boosting support to civil society including the civil society that is functioning in exile, because there are countries where domestic civil society is simply unable to work due to safety issues, due to life-threatening conditions, basically, where any sort of a like can actually, and lead a person to be imprisoned for 25 years or even longer. So support to exiled organizations is quite important. So I think there, and with taking into account also the loss of the funding that was coming from the United States, that needs to be also rethought, and I believe a creation of some sort of a funding mechanism in addition to the existing mechanisms in Europe, maybe by Baltic and Scandinavian countries, maybe together with European Union colleagues or separately, would be an idea to explore, and see what sort of resources can be attributed to development and support, and also institutional support of civil society in exile from Central Asia, because otherwise we have right now something unthinkable, that was unthinkable just a couple of years ago. For example, the leading investigative journalism outlets from Kyrgyzstan are now forced to function, to work out of Europe. And they are also facing, obviously, losing funding due to Americans changing their opinion about things in the world. So I believe these are things that are very important to focus on, and also to keep the issue of kleptocracy and corruption at the top of the list to be discussed.
Thank you very much, Leila. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I'd like to give a chance to our three other speakers, Kate, Tom, and Oliver, if you want to answer any of the previous questions or give some kind of very short, if possible, concluding remarks. Thank you.
Let me just briefly, the difficulty that we face is that with these countries, we do have to cooperate with them in many different spheres. What we do find is that when those economic ties deepen with kleptocracies, and I already mentioned Deutsche Bank and Turkmenistan, for example, it becomes harder and harder to investigate those kleptocratic flows, and we ourselves become enmeshed in those networks. So the deals themselves usually end in tears, as we found with the ENRC in listing in London. So we have to kind of take a step back and think, is this kind of integration of our financial and business systems the right way to go because of what that causes?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you again to everyone. I guess I would just to follow a little bit on what Tom said. I think we have to do a really hard look in the West, and I'm speaking as an American, so the last 8-9 months in particular have been really shocking for all of us. We need to take a really hard look at what our priorities are and what the standards are, and what does it mean to engage in this type of economic and financial activity, and to hold ourselves to the standards that we, at least used to talk about around the rest of the world. These are global systems, and so we all have to participate in them with the same degree of integrity. And I think that's part of where we need to take a step back.
Oliver, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'd just say, thank you very much for having been here, for listening, but I thought the gentleman who raised the question about the relationship between security and cooperation made a really good point. I think that, there is a feeling that perhaps, fighting corruption is expensive, that it costs us money, but actually in the long term and the long run, fighting kleptocracy will make us all better off and will make us all happier. It may look annoying in the short term to have to, put money into law enforcement agencies to make the effort to secure these international agreements. But in the long run, this is the basis, democracy is the basis of Western civilization. And, we're never going to be better at corruption than the governments in Moscow and Beijing, but we can be better at democracy. So, in the long run, it's in our interests to do the right thing. And that, I suppose, is something to take away from this, this difficult period, particularly with regard to what's been happening in the United States, where we rather got used to having an ally, and it's a bit difficult to have a government that is operating very much against the kind of interests I think we're all in favour of.
All right, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we need to close. I guess this conversation could go on for a long time. I'd really like to thank our speakers for the excellent presentation, the discussion. For those of you who might not be aware of what Freedom for Eurasia and Crude Accountability are doing, I really very, very strongly recommend you to go on their websites, and with plenty of excellent reports, so please read them. They are really excellent material on both websites. So thank you again, all of you, for having been with us today, to the audience for the discussions, and I guess we look forward to seeing you in another panel on this very important and I would say sad topic. So thank you very much.